Okay, in our last video, we talked about chalk and dye ink, and now we're going to talk about pigment inks. Okay, pigment inks are going to be a very wet ink. They're going to be the ink that takes the longest to dry. They're going to be an ink that you're going to need to stamp and do something else while it dries, or you're going to have to heat set it with a heat gun. You're not going to want to just stamp it and stamp something and cut it right out because it's going to smear. For instance, if we do our heart in this blue, okay, make sure we ink this up good. So again, we're doing pigment now. Okay. So I have my blue, and I'm touching it, and look what I did. Okay, I smeared it. So they stay wet longer. It's going to be something that you can use and just have to heat set it, or just really give it some time to dry before you go in and maybe handle it to cut it out or something like that. But one thing that is nice about them is that you can emboss with them. And what I mean by that is you can add embossing powder. And this is a clear embossing powder. You can add that on top of a color. So if I added it on top of the blue heart, I would heat set it and I would get like a shiny blue heart. I did it with a pink, so let me just clean off this stamp here pretty good, and then we'll do that in a pink, and I'll show you what it looks like. Make sure we get all that off, because that ink really stays on. Okay. Alright, and then we'll dry it off. Okay. So I'm going to use the pink one. Pink heart is pretty. Get it really wet. Okay. Okay. So, and I got a little blue still on it, but for the video's sake, work with me and it's all pink. Okay. So, what I did is just I sprinkled on that embossing powder. And then I'm left with some powder on my heart. And then I would heat set that with a heat gun. And then I would end up with this. So I would end up with a shiny, glossy heart. Now, if I wanted to do a red heart with some of this embossing powder that has some glitter in it, I would go ahead and I could stamp it in my blue pigment ink, I could stamp it in my pink, I could stamp it in whatever color pigment ink I had handy, and I would just be covering it up. And then I would heat set it, and that's what I would get. I would get a nice sparkly little heart. And I did this with the pink ink. So you can't tell that there's pink underneath of it. So if you ever see any pigment ink on clearance or something, go ahead and pick it up. And if you have some colored embossing powder, again, black, gold, whatever, there's every color in embossing powder. If you use a colored powder, it will not matter what color ink you have underneath of it. No one's going to see it. So it could be a really ugly color, and it doesn't matter. You're going to cover it up, and no one's going to see it. It just keeps it wet. It keeps it so that you can heat it and make it into either something glossy or something maybe a little chunky, like with this glitter in it. And there's all kinds of different embossing powders too. We can make a couple of videos off of that too later on. But that's just some basics. Another thing to use for embossing would be this Versamark ink pad, and this ink pad would simply kind of be like it's very sticky. It's almost like a kind of a glue, I guess, when you're kind of inking it on your stamp. And you would put it on your paper, same way you do with the other pigment inks. Although this is not a pigment ink, this is a watermark. But it's going to be similar to your pigment ink in the fact that it's going to be very wet. It's going to hold your powder on it, and then you heat set it, and you get something like that. If you would stamp onto a colored piece of cardstock with this, you're just going to get, you know, literally a watermark, just a deepening of the color that you stamp it on. So it's kind of useful too. But again, pigment inks are going to be helpful for embossing as well. So we're going to get into some more ways that we use these inks when I do some of our card tutorials coming up. So just as a few basics, what I would recommend, definitely get your Memento. Okay, get Memento dye ink, because that's going to be very helpful for lots of cards that we make. I hope you enjoyed the series, and we will be making more next week.